Chapter 5 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 5 Men and Masters.
"Well, Stephen,"
said Bounderby, in his windy manner,
"what's this I hear? What have these pests of the earth been doing to you? Come in and speak up."
It was into the drawing-room that he was thus bidden. A tea-table was set out, and Mr. Bounderby's young wife, and her brother, and a great gentleman from London were present, to whom Stephen made his obeisance, closing the door and standing near it, with his hat in his hand.
"This is the man I was telling you about, Harthouse,"
said Mr. Bounderby. The gentleman he addressed, who was talking to Mrs. Bounderby on the sofa, got up, saying in an indolent way,
"Oh, really?"
and dawdled to the hearth-rug where Mr. Bounderby stood.
"Now,"
said Bounderby.
"speak up."
After the 4 days he had passed, this address fell rudely and discordantly on Stephen's ear. Besides being a rough handling of his wounded mind, it seemed to assume that he really was the self-interested deserter he had been called.
"What were it, sir?"
said Stephen.
"As you were pleased to want with me?"
"Why, I've told you,"
returned Bounderby.
"Speak up like a man, since you're a man, and tell us about yourself and this combination."
"With your pardon, sir,"
said Stephen Blackpool,
"I ha' nowt to say about it."
Mr. Bounderby, who was always more or less like a wind, finding something in his way here, began to blow at it directly.
"Now look here, Harthouse,"
said he.
"Here's a specimen of 'em. When this man was here once before, I warned this man against the mischievous strangers who are always about, and who ought to be hanged wherever they are found, and I told this man that he was going in the wrong direction. Now would you believe it, that although they've put this mark upon him, he's such a slave to 'em still, that he's afraid to open his lips about 'em."
"I said I had nowt to say about it, sir, nor as I were fearful of opening my lips."
"You said? I know what you said. More than that, I know what you mean, you see. Not always the same thing, by the Lord Harry. Quite different things. You had better tell us at once that that fellow Slackbridge is not in the town stirring up the people to mutiny, and that he is not a regular qualified leader of the people. That is a most confounded scoundrel. You'd better tell us so at once. You can't deceive me. You want to tell us so. Why don't you?"
"I'm as sorry as you are, sir, when people's leader is bad,"
said Stephen, shaking his head.
"They take such as offers. Haply 'tis the smallest of their misfortunes when they can get no better."
The wind began to get boisterous.
"Now you'll think this pretty well, Harthouse,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"You'll think this is tolerably strong. You'll say, upon my soul, that this is a tidy specimen of what my friends have to deal with. But this is nothing, sir. You shall hear me ask this man a question. Pray, Mr. Blackpool, may I take the liberty of asking you how it happens that you refuse to be in this combination?"
"How's happens?"
"Ah,"
said Mr. Bounderby, with his thumbs in the arms of his coat, and jerking his head and shutting his eyes in confidence with the opposite wall.
"how it happens?"
"I'd liefer not come to it, sir, but sin as you ask question, and I'll not want it be ill-mannered, I'll answer. I ha' passed a promise."
"Not to me, you know,"
said Bounderby. Gusty weather with deceitful calms, one now prevailing.
"Oh no, sir, not to you."
"As for me, any consideration for me has had just nothing at all to do with it,"
said Bounderby, still in confidence with the wall.
"If only Josiah Bounderby of Corktown had been in question, you would have joined and made no bones about it."
"Why, yes, sir, 'tis true."
"Though he knows,"
said Mr. Bounderby, now blowing a gale,
that there are a set of rascals and rebels whom transportation is too good for. Now, Mr. Harthouse, you've been knocking about the world some time. Did you ever meet with anything like that man out of this blessed country?"
"Nay, ma'am,"
said Stephen Blackpool, staunchly protesting against the words that had been used, and instinctively addressing himself to Louisa, after glancing at her face.
"Not rebels, nor yet rascals. No to kind, ma'am, no to kind. They've not done me a kindness, ma'am, as I know and feel. But there's not a dozen men amongst 'em, ma'am, a dozen, not 6, but what believes as he's done his duty by rest and by his cell. God forbid as I as has known, as had th' experience of these men all my life, I as has etten and drunken wi' 'em, and seeken with 'em when I'm toiling wi' 'em, and loving 'em, should fail for to stand by 'em wi' truth, let 'em who has done to me what they may."
He spoke with the rugged earnestness of his place and character, deepened perhaps by a proud consciousness that he was faithful to his class under all their mistrust. But he fully remembered where he was, and did not even raise his voice.
"No, ma'am, no. They're true to one another, faithful to one another, affectionate to one another, e'en to death. Be poor amongst 'em, sick amongst 'em, grieve amongst 'em, ony the mony causes that carries grief to the poor man's door, and they'll be tender wi' yo, gentle wi' yo, comfortable wi' yo, christen wi' yo. Be sure of that, ma'am. They'll be riven to bits ere ever they be different."
"In short,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"it's because they're so full of virtues that they've turned you adrift. Go through with it while you're about it. Out with it."
"How it is, ma'am,"
resumed Stephen, appearing still to find his natural refuge in Louisa's face,
"that what is best in us folk seems to turn us most to trouble and misfortune and mistake. I dunno, but 'tis so. I know it is, as I know th' heavens above me ain't smoke. We're patient too, and wanting general to do right, and I canna think the fault is all wi' us."
"Now, my friend,"
said Mr. Bounderby, whom he could not have exasperated more, quite unconscious of it though he was, than by seeming to appeal to any one else,
"if you will favour me with your attention for half a minute, I should like to have a word or two with you. You said just now that you had nothing to tell us about this business. You're quite sure of that before we go any further?"
"Sir, I'm sure on it."
"Here's a gentleman from London present."
Mr. Bounderby made a back-handed point at Mr. James Harthouse with his thumb.
"A Parliament gentleman. I should like him to hear a short bit of dialogue between you and me, instead of taking the substance of it, for I know precious well beforehand what it will be. Nobody knows better than I do. Take notice. Instead of receiving it on trust from my mouth."
Stephen bent his head to the gentleman from London, and showed a rather more troubled mind than usual. He turned his eyes involuntarily to his former refuge, but at a look from that quarter, expressive though instantaneous, he settled them on Mr. Bounderby's face.
"Now, what you complain of?"
asked Mr. Bounderby.
"I ha' not come here, sir,
Stephen reminded him.
to complain. I come for what I was sent for."
"What
repeated Mr. Bounderby, folding his arms.
do you people, in a general way, complain of?"
Stephen looked at him with some little irresolution for a moment, and then seemed to make up his mind.
"Sir, I were never good at showing out, though I have my share of feeling it. 'Deed, we're in a muddle, sir. Look round town, so rich as 'tis, and see number of people has been broughten into here for weave, and for card, and for piece out of living, all the same way somehows, 'twixt the candles and the graves. Look how we live, and where we live, and in what numbers, and by what chances, and with what sameness, and look how mills is allers a going, and how they never works us no near to any distant object, 'cepting always death. Look how you consider us, and writes of us, and talks of us, and goes up with your deputations to Secretaries of State about us, and how you're always right, and how we're always wrong, and never had no reason in us since we were born. Look how this has grown and grown, sir, bigger and bigger, broader and broader, harder and harder, fra year to year, fra generation unto generation. Who can look on it, sir, and fairly tell a man 'tis nor a muddle?"
"Of course,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"Now perhaps you'll let the gentleman know how you would set this muddle, as you're so fond of calling it, to rights."
"I dunno, sir, I canna be expected to. 'Tis not me as should be looking for that, sir. 'Tis them as is put o'er me, and o'er all the rest of us. What do they take upon 'emselves, sir, if not for to do it?"
"I'll tell you something towards it, at any rate,"
returned Bounderby.
"We will make an example of half a dozen slack bridges. We'll indict the blackguards for felony, and get 'em shift off to penal settlements."
Stephen gravely shook his head.
"Don't tell me we won't, man,"
said Bounderby, by this time blowing a hurricane.
"because we will, I tell you."
"Sir,"
returned Stephen, with the quiet confidence of absolute certainty,
"if you were to take 100 slack bridges, all as there is, and all the number 10 times towards, and was to sew 'em up in separate sacks, and sink 'em in deepest ocean as were made ere ever dry land come to be, you'd leave the muddle just where it is. Mischievous strangers,"
said Stephen, with an anxious smile.
"When I were norrern, I'm sure, sin ever we were called to mind at mischievous strangers, 'tis not by them the trouble's made, sir. 'Tis not with them it commences. I owe no favour for them. I owe no reason to favour 'em, but 'tis hopeless and useless to dream of taking them from the trade, 'stead of taking the trade fra them. All that know about me in this room were here afore I come, and will be here when I'm gone. Put that clock aboard a ship and pack it off to Norfolk Island, and the time will go on just the same. So 'tis with Slackbridge every bit."
Reverting for a moment to his former refuge, he observed a cautionary movement of her eyes towards the door. Stepping back, he put his hand upon the lock. But he had not spoken out of his own will and desire, and he felt it in his heart a noble return for his late injurious treatment to be faithful to the last to those who had repudiated him. He stayed to finish what was in his mind.
"Sir, I canna with my little learning and my common way tell the gentleman what will better all this, though some working men of this town code above my powers, but I can tell him what will never do. The strong hand will never do it. Victory and triumph will never do it. Agreeing for to make one side unnaturally always and forever right, and t'other side unnaturally always and forever wrong will never, never do it. Nor yet letting alone will never do it. Let thousands upon thousands alone, all leading the like lives and all falling into like muddle, as they will be as one, and you will be as another, wi' a black unpassable world betwixt you, just as long or short a time as such like misery can last, not drawing nigh to folk with kindness and patience and cheery ways, that so draws nigh to one another in their money troubles, and so cherishes one another in their distresses with what they need themselves. Like I humbly believe as no people the gentleman has seen in no his travels can beat, will never do till the sun turns to ice. Most of all, rating 'em as so much power, and regulating 'em as if they were figures in a sumer, machines, without love and likings, without memories and inclinations, without souls to weary and souls to hope. When all goes quiet, dragging on with 'em as if they'd nowt at kind, and when all goes on quiet, reproaching 'em for the want of such humany feelings in their dealings with you. This'll never do, sir, till God's work is onmade."
Stephen stood with the open door in his hand, waiting to know if anything more were expected of him.
"Just stop a moment,"
said Mr. Bounderby, excessively red in the face.
"I told you, the last time you were here with your grievance, that you had better turn about and come out of that. And I also told you, if you remember, that I was up to the Gold Spoon look-out."
I were not up to it, my sense, sir, I do assure you.
Now, it's clear to me,
said Mr. Bounderby,
that you are one of those chaps who have always got a grievance, and you go about sowing it and raising crops. That's the business of your life, my friend.
Stephen shook his head, mutely protesting that indeed he had other business to do for his life.
You're such a waspish, raspish, ill-conditioned chap, you see,
said Mr. Bounderby,
that even your own union, the men who know you best, will have nothing to do with you. I never thought those fellows could be right in anything, but I tell you what, I so far go along with 'em for a novelty, that I'll have nothing to do with you either.
Stephen raised his eyes quickly to his face.
You can finish off what you're at,
said Mr. Bounderby, with a meaning nod.
and then go elsewhere.
Sir, you know weel,
said Stephen, expressively.
that if I cannot get work with you, I cannot get it elsewhere.
The reply was,
What I know, and what you know, you know. I have no more to say about it.
Stephen glanced at Louisa again, but her eyes were raised to his no more. Therefore, with a sigh, and saying barely above his breath,
Heaven help us all in this world.
he departed. End of chapter 5.